Alright guys, so I got a pretty wild follow-up here on a story that I mentioned last week because the New York Times is currently devolving into utter chaos and actually launching what's effectively just a witch hunt against their own employees to try to find some leakers who spoke to other outlets like The Intercept, as The Intercept was basically working to debunk this major article that was written a couple of months ago in the New York Times that has been just like widely discredited. So I'm going to give you guys a little recap here in terms of what has been happening over the last couple of weeks, and then we're going to get into the witch hunt, which is disproportionately going after the Arab reporters that happen to be at the New York Times. So like a racially motivated, politically motivated witch hunt at the so-called paper of record at the NYT. So this was the original article that was written by a couple different people. Here we have Jeffrey Gettleman, Anat Schwartz, and Adam Sella. Okay, and it was called Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th. And so the whole idea of this article was we are going to prove the narrative that was being pushed by the Israeli government at the time, that Hamas not only like engaged in some isolated instances of sexual assault, but that it was like this pre-planned, mass sexual assault that they engaged in as a weapon of war, as a part of the attack that they planned on October 7th, right? So that was the narrative that they were trying to go with. And they had all of these different stories and examples in this, and it ended up being, again, widely discredited and debunked, to the point where even some of the family members of the people who they wrote about as victims of rape in this article, the families came out and they said, no, you did this interview with us under false pretenses, you're lying about this, that wasn't even logistically possible to have happened, and it was just an incredibly bizarre situation, right? And so we figure out slowly over time what was actually going on. It started with this report, really, that came out from The Intercept. They say the New York Times puts the daily episode, which is the New York Times daily podcast, obviously, on ice amid internal firestorm over Hamas sexual violence article. And so basically what they were talking about here is that the daily, the New York Times podcast, they were going to try to do a segment or a show or an episode on this article. And as they were going through the process of trying to fact check the article, they realized we can't do this episode because we can't fact check what was written in this article. And a lot of it, turns out, is not reliable in any capacity whatsoever, right? So they put this on ice. It becomes this entire, big firestorm and debate over it. Go ahead and donate to the Intercept if you want to there. But it becomes this entire, firestorm, internal debates flying around. How did this story even originally get published? How did this make it through the editing room and all of that good stuff? And so then we get this follow-up story here, again, from The Intercept. So shout out to Jeremy Scahill, Ryan Grimm, and Daniel Boguslaw. But this one was called Between the Hammer and the Anvil, the story behind the New York Times October 7th expose. And so again, I'm going to link this down below if you guys want to go read this entire article. I do recommend it. But the details in terms of who were the authors on this paper that was written, on this article that was written, who are the authors of this, what were the strategies that they used to eventually write this paper and to collect evidence, even though there was no real evidence that was provided, and how did the New York Times end up publishing this story, right? Because there's so many different layers to this. So again, the basic TLDR is that they hired these three people here: Jeffrey Gettleman, Anat Schwartz, and Adam Sella. This just happens to be the nephew of this journalist, Anat Schwartz. Now, it came out that Anat Schwartz, one of the major, people working on that original article, was liking openly genocidal tweets, okay? Calling for like Gaza to be turned into a slaughterhouse, for example, and for there to be no regard for or care for civilian life, and to be disproportionate and all of that stuff, right? Violate any norm on the way to victory. Those in front of us are human animals, right? So this is the kind of stuff that people figured out, thanks to Z Squirrel over on Twitter, that she was liking. Okay, so already massive red flags, right? This is supposedly a journalist who is writing articles specifically about Israel and Gaza. You're supposed to be a journalist. You're supposed to be somewhat objective in your reporting, right? And she's going and liking tweets calling to turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse. So this in and of itself, massive scandal. Then we get further details, okay? This woman, Anat Schwartz, had no previous experience in journalism. Let me say that again. No previous experience in journalism before somehow, for some reason, the New York Times decided to hire her and then put her in charge of running the investigation on what eventually became this massively influential article that came out. Because keep in mind, guys, at the time that this article came out, This was basically just an effort to try to give a second wind, successfully to a large degree, to Israel's onslaught of the people of Gaza. It was an effort to say, look at how barbaric and monstrous Hamas is, and by extension the Palestinian people, because they support Hamas. Look at how, animalistic these people are, that they would plot this mass sexual assault on the people of Israel, right? To justify then Israel's response to that being equally, if not more, barbaric. So that is the purpose of that kind of an article. It is to bolster the Israeli war effort's case, okay? And so at the time, this was hugely influential. And I've seen so many different cases of U.S. politicians, Israeli politicians, pundits, everybody all over the place using that kind of a narrative that there was this mass pre-planned sexual assault by Hamas as a justification for what Israel is currently doing in Gaza, right? Not that even if it was true that would be a justification for slaughtering 30,000 civilians, but that's part of the main series of arguments that they have been putting forward. So anyways, turns out she had no previous journalistic experience, but she did have experience working in the IDF Air Force, okay, in the, I believe, intelligence unit, right? So the New York Times is hiring somebody who was previously, an Air Force intelligence unit official or officer or whatever you want to say, and they hire her to go and do the investigation in this. And they get into so many different details where, like, while she was doing the research into this, she scoured everywhere, right? Hospitals, sexual assault crisis lines, everywhere you could possibly go to try to track down instances of people who were sexually assaulted on October 7th. She could not find any, okay? None whatsoever, right? For this report. She did rely on incredibly unreliable sources, like here they point out in The Nation that she heavily relied on Zaka, which was described by The Intercept as a private, ultra-Orthodox rescue organization that has been documented to have mishandled evidence and spread multiple false stories about the events of October 7th, including debunked allegations of Hamas operatives beheading babies, the famous 40 beheaded babies claim, and cutting a fetus from a pregnant woman's body. Right? Its workers are not trained in forensic science or crime scene experts, right? So these are the kinds of people and organizations that she was relying on for evidence, right? As well as like anonymous Israeli officials or soldiers or whatever. But there was no actual forensic or direct evidence of this claim of mass sexual assault, right? Now, I want to make the point that, like, I'm not saying that there were no instances of sexual assault on October 7th. I think it's probably incredibly likely that there were some instances of that, but not the narrative that was being sold by this New York Times piece, and not the narrative that was and still is being sold by the Israeli government and the U.S. government now, that it was some sort of like a strategy of war, that this was a mass sexual assault event. It just wasn't. There's no evidence for that in any way, shape, or form. But that's the narrative that they decided to go with. And so again, the details on how they went about doing this research, they couldn't really find anything. They still decide to write the story, basically just working backwards from their conclusion. They said, this is the narrative that we want. Let's just make it fit no matter how little evidence we find, no matter how much contradictory evidence we find. Let's just make it fit, right? And so again, go read this article if you want all of the, the background on all of this. But I think the real question here is not just this specific author, Anat Schwartz, or her nephew, or whatever the fuck, and how abysmal they were at doing anything closely resembling journalism. But it's more so about the New York Times, right? How does the New York Times hire this person in the first place? Who hired her, number one? How does this story get published? How does this get past the editors, even though they didn't have any real evidence to back up the claims that they were making? So how does it get published? How did she get hired in the first place? And almost more importantly than any of that, why the fuck is the New York Times still running this story? This story has not been taken down. This story has not been corrected in any serious way. So they are still standing by this story, even though it was widely debunked, okay? And this is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life from a so-called journalist. So this was one of the other authors on the piece, Jeffrey Gettleman, okay? Who was doing this talk, I guess, at one of these panels. This looks like the Institute of Global Politics. And this subject came up, and he basically just straight up says he doesn't think as a journalist that he needs to provide evidence for the things that he's writing about. Let's go ahead and listen to this. It's unreal.
Colleagues, and we interviewed almost 200 people over the course of 2 months. And what we found, I don't want to even use the word evidence, because evidence is almost like a legal term that suggests you're trying to prove an allegation or prove a case in court. That's not my role. We all have our roles, and my role is to document.
Okay, so he views his role as just to document. To document what exactly? I guess in this instance it would be a completely made up, debunked narrative? Is that what we're saying now? That the job of a journalist is just to tell a story, regardless of whether or not there is actual verifiable evidence that backs up that story. Okay, and keeping in mind that the broader context of this is that this is one of these stories that was used to further justify a genocide. Okay, so that's the broader context of this reporting, which makes it all worse. But just logistically, like, you want to call yourself a journalist and you don't believe that you need proper evidence to run a story like that? I mean, I've never heard any journalist just openly admit it like that, right? Clearly, I think the US media has many different issues, but to just outright come out and say, yeah, I mean, we're not proving a case in court. Well, sure, you're not proving a case in court. And in many stories that, writers and journalists do write about, they don't have 100% of the details about 100% of the story. Of course not. But to say that you don't think you need evidence to prove your claims, I mean, it's just, it is so beyond wild. So you have 3 people working on the story. Anat Schwartz, who has no experience in journalism. You have Jeffrey Gettleman, who apparently thinks that journalists don't need to provide real evidence to back up their claims. And then you have this guy, Adam Sella, who apparently is the nephew of Anat Schwartz. None of these people should have been writing about this in the first place. If you were going to do an investigation on sexual assault on October 7th, you should have done it the proper way and then written about it in an objective way, not to try to spin some sort of a narrative, right? And so now we get to the leak investigation, right? Here from Vanity Fair, New York Times launches leak investigation over report on its Israel-Gaza coverage. So this is going back to that original article here on them putting the daily episode on ice, as the Intercept was pointing out there. And so instead of like doing a reflection on how this person in Nat Schwartz was hired, how this ended up getting through the editing people and actually going live and being published, and what does this say broadly about their coverage of Israel and Gaza, and could they potentially have some biases that are infused in their reporting, right? Instead of doing any analysis about that or holding anybody at the higher echelons of the New York Times leadership accountable, they decide to go after lower level employees to hunt down whoever talked to the Intercept on that story. They say the New York Times is conducting a leak investigation following a report in The Intercept about a yet-to-be-aired episode of The Daily addressing explosive claims of sexual violence committed by Hamas on October 7th. Management in recent weeks has pulled at least 24 staffers, including Daily producers, into meetings in an attempt to understand how internal details about the podcast's editorial process got out, according to multiple sources familiar with the matter. The investigation, I'm told, is being led by Charlotte Berendt, the paper's Director of Policy and Internal Investigations. They say in late January, The Intercept reported that the Times had planned to air this episode of The Daily weeks earlier, that was based on a December Times investigation led by Pulitzer Prize winner Jeffrey Gettleman, the same guy we just watched, and co-authored again by Nat Schwartz and Adam Sella, about how Hamas weaponized sexual violence. But the paper shelved that episode amid a furious internal debate about the strength of the paper's original reporting on the subject, according to The Intercept, which noted that a new script was drafted that offered major caveats, allowed for uncertainty, and asked open-ended questions that were absent from the original article, which presented its findings as definitive evidence of systemic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. So, I mean, that's what you really should have done, right? I don't even think that they should have pulled this daily episode. You should have done it, but you should have done an episode where you were correcting what the original report got wrong, or pointing out the massive gaps in some of the claims that they made without any real evidence, or pointed out that a lot of the sources they used were completely unreliable, previously exposed liars, right? That's what you would do if you had integrity. You would correct the original report. They didn't do that. They just said, we're not going to, put this episode out for now, and then maybe we'll take the coward's way out, right? So they say Daniel Boguslaw and Brian Grimm suggested that producers and the paper face a conundrum. Quote, run a version that hews closely to the previously published story and risk republishing serious mistakes, or publish a heavily toned down version raising questions about whether the paper still stands by its original support. And we'll get to that here in a second, because they apparently are standing by this original report. So they say it's highly unusual for the Times to conduct a leak investigation, with multiple staffers saying that this is the first such internal probe that they can recall taking place. They said it's not something we do. That kind of witch hunt is really concerning. Though information has leaked in our past, it's par for the course for a newsroom as sprawling and influential as the Times. That disclosure presumably cuts deeper because it described internal decision making around a story that had yet to be published. So these people are calling it a witch hunt, which I don't really think there's any other way to describe it. And so now we get to this. This was posted by the Union Times, which is the news guild for New York Times workers, right? And so this is what they had to say. They talk about how they're announcing this investigation into the leaks and everything. But I want to skip to this second one because this has some of the pretty revealing things here. They say management's investigators have questioned employees about their involvement in the Times' internal Middle Eastern and North African Times employee research group, known as the MENA Collective, ordered them to hand over the names of all MENA Collective's active members involved in group discussions and demanded copies of personal communications between colleagues about their shared workplace concerns. Okay, so first off, they're not even doing an investigation into trying to get down to the bottom of the leaks necessarily. They're just targeting the Middle Eastern and North African Times research or resource group, okay? So you're specifically targeting people based on like ethnic grounds, right? And ordering them to hand over the names of all active members in group discussions and demanding copies of personal communications between colleagues about their shared workplace concerns. They say members of the MENA Collective have faced extensive questioning about their views of the Times coverage. Again, that's not relevant to what you're supposedly investigating here, right? They say even though that is not the basis for the investigation, no one should be made to feel singled out and unwelcome at their workplace because of their ethnic background or racial identity. Additionally, our members have been questioned about the fact that they raised concerns about coverage to standards, even when these members went above and beyond to follow company policies about providing feedback internally, as the Times encourages its journalists to do. So they're going after certain people who may have previously gone through all of the proper channels to raise concerns about Israel's biased coverage against Palestinians since October 7th. So they're targeting these people for doing the right thing, for doing the thing that the New York Times says that they want their journalists to do, right? Because if there is an issue with reporting at a news organization like this, especially one like the New York Times, you do want people to be able to speak out. You don't want there to be some like culture of fear where if anybody takes issue with the way that, you're framing your coverage, that they can't speak out, right? Otherwise, you're just doing rank propaganda. And so the New York Times, of course, responds and goes after the people who are raising some of those concerns. So really, it's a targeted witch hunt against people who had issues with their broad coverage of Israel and Gaza. It's not even necessarily trying to get to the bottom of figuring out who leaked certain pieces of information about the Daily to the Intercept, right? It's much broader than that. And it's clearly racially motivated. I mean, this is just totally insane. No self-reflection about how you actually failed in your reporting standards and completely embarrassed yourself in front of everybody, or trying to rectify it or trying to correct the record or, actually going up the chain instead of down the chain and going up and trying to figure out, who hired this person, Anat Schwartz? How did this get through the editing room? All of those questions, right? They're targeting people below them, not anybody above them for any sort of accountability on this. And so here, directly from Anat Schwartz, who obviously, after it was exposed that she liked these genocidal tweets, deleted everything off of her account, went private, and then she just recently posted this, though. And this is amazing. She said, "I'm thankful to the New York Times for standing behind the important stories we have published. The Times didn't just stand behind me, but also behind the many women whose stories needed to be told. The recent attacks against me will not deter me from continuing my work." Well, apparently she's been pushed out from the New York Times, so it will, you will not be able to continue doing that at the New York Times, at least, I guess, right? But she picked out this screenshot. It's just so good. She picked out this screenshot that was actually from this story written by The Intercept, right, on how abysmal her reporting was and how much of an embarrassment this is for the New York Times. And she pulled out this one quote where, of course, they say that the Times international editor, Phil Pan, said in a statement that he stands by the work. Ms. Schwartz was part of a rigorous reporting and editing process. Not really. She made valuable contributions. Not really. And we saw no evidence of bias in her work. No evidence of bias in her work. Okay? Again, families of the victims that she wrote about, that made up huge bulks of what that initial article was about, came out and discredited her reporting. I mean, the notion that she did not have bias in her work as she's going and liking tweets saying that Gaza should be turned to a slaughterhouse. Other likes that she had previously had on Twitter showed that she was liking tweets saying that essentially Israel needs to ramp up their Hasbara efforts, their propaganda efforts, to compare Hamas to ISIS, right? To make them sound like they're one and the same thing. This person is not only a biased journalist, she is not a journalist. She is purely essentially working as a spokeswoman for Israel's war on Gaza. And this was a convenient story to write, not to help Israeli women who have potentially suffered from sexual assault, not to get to the bottom of the truth of the October 7th attack, but just to spin a narrative to help Israel to get a second win to continue the war, as there was a lot of pressure building around them to end the offensive at the time. They say, we remain confident in the accuracy of our reporting and stand by the team's investigation. But as we have said, her likes of offensive and opinionated social media posts predating her work with us are unacceptable. So they're basically just saying, this is only, our only issue with Anat Schwartz is the likes that she had on her Twitter, which apparently came before she was writing this piece for the New York Times. So, but you don't have issue with the actual reporting. The fact that she used sources like Zaka, which are totally unreliable. The fact that other sources that she used were also caught lying on numerous different occasions and changing their stories repeatedly. The fact that she openly admitted, as Ryan points out in this article, that she went to all of these different places and couldn't find any evidence of the claims that she was making. I mean, she did this whole part. Large part of this article that they wrote was based on an interview that Anat Schwartz did in Hebrew, right, with some Israeli outlet. And I don't think, maybe she didn't realize it because she's not a journalist, but she was revealing a lot, okay, about what she thinks her job was. And it was certainly not to do objective reporting on October 7th in any capacity whatsoever. But the New York Times says that they stand by it. I mean, just a total embarrassment and a sham. And again, just as a comparison here point, from the Washington Post, New York Times writer quits over open letter accusing Israel of genocide. So this woman, Jasmine Hughes, was basically forced out. She was pressured to resign because the New York Times said she violated their policies when she signed an open letter that was saying Israel is committing a genocide. So when a New York Times author or a New York Times employee signs a letter saying that another country, a foreign government, is committing a genocide, which has nothing to do with the New York Times specifically or their coverage, right? When she signs an open letter accusing them of genocide, she's forced out. But this woman, Anat Schwartz, can have no journalistic experience whatsoever, can, have connections with the Israeli government and military, come and write this paper with massive holes in it and debunked portions of it, and then that gets through the entire process and gets published, right? I mean, I've shown you other examples as well where Palestinian journalists have just been censored or not allowed to cover Israel and Gaza because, well, you're going to be biased because you're Palestinian. But that doesn't apply here, right? You can literally be a former IDF member, and that won't apply at a lot of these places. There's no bias there, apparently. I mean, think about that, guys. Just from an objective news standpoint, right? Think about if we were back in the 1940s, right? In the middle of the Holocaust, and some journalist decided to come out and sign an open letter condemning Hitler's Holocaust of the Jewish people. Does anybody think that it would be right for them to be fired or pushed out of their jobs because they're recognizing and condemning a genocide? No, it's only because it was something that was critical of Israel that she was then pushed out. And this person wasn't even covering at the Times, I believe. She wasn't even covering Israel and Gaza. So, I mean, imagine if this was any other country. If somebody signed an open letter, condemning Iran's authoritarian crackdown on protesters or something, or CCP censorship and authoritarianism, or whatever the case may be, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How many journalists, I wonder how many journalists for these major outlets signed letters condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? But it's just because it's Israel that somehow there's a carve-out for it. You can't criticize Israel openly or now you're massively biased, which the opposite should be the case, right? Any objective reporting or investigative work in terms of what Israel is doing in Gaza right now will reflect poorly on Israel. It will read, if it's honest, as something that is massively negative on Israel, right? But that's if you're being objective. The point of journalism is not to be neutral, right? Which obviously they haven't even been neutral, as we've been talking about repeatedly with all the abysmal coverage from mainstream media and how warped they are, right? With their disproportionate coverage and the types of language that they use when they're talking about Israelis who were killed versus Palestinians who were killed. So we've talked a lot about that. But the objective in a so-called democracy with a free press and a First Amendment, right? The goal of a journalist is to be objective, not to be neutral. There's that famous saying where it's like, if two people are debating whether or not it's raining outside and you're trying to report on it, your job as a journalist is not to say, well, one person says it's raining outside and the other person says it's not raining outside. Your job as a journalist is to stick your hand out the window and tell people whether or not it's raining outside. In the same sense, if Israel is making repeated debunked lies about what they're doing inside of Gaza, if they're slaughtering innocent men, women, and children, and then you present like what happened the other day, the Flower Massacre, right? Well, Israel says that all of these Palestinians simply killed themselves amid a big, crunch of people as they were rushing the aid trucks, and then Palestinians and the doctors on the ground and the verifiable video evidence that we have, they say that it was actually Israelis shooting at them. Your job is not to present those claims as if they're equally valid. If the evidence falls on one side, then you report it as such. That's what being a journalist is. That's what being objective on these issues is. But the New York Times doesn't see it that way. They see their job apparently to just push one narrative in order to bolster Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. And the irony, of all of this is that, I mentioned this in a recent story as well, but UN experts are now condemning credible reports of executions and sexual assault by Israeli soldiers. So everything really, every accusation really is a confession, especially when it comes to Israel. Everything that they accuse Hamas of doing is stuff that they're doing, right? Now, again, I'm not saying that there is no chance that there was a sexual assault that happened on October 7th. That happens in many different war scenarios or attack scenarios. That's very normal, unfortunately. Sexual assault as a part of war, that wouldn't be outlandish for me to believe that that did happen. But the idea that it was this mass, coordinated, pre-planned tactic of war, that's been completely debunked. That is not true. There is no evidence for that in any capacity whatsoever. And you also see the discrepancy between how U.S. officials, unlike the State Department, like Matthew Miller and John Kirby, how they responded to the allegations of sexual assault by Hamas versus how they're now responding to reports like this. Because when it comes to the allegations against Hamas, even if they're unproven, even if there's no verifiable evidence to back them up, they immediately come out and they condemn it. But when it comes to this, I've seen the videos, guys. They'll come out and they'll make every excuse in the book to not condemn it, right? They'll say, oh, there needs to be further investigation. Well, I need to see some sort of like credible witness testimony or doctors coming out to talk about this, even though they already have. But things like that. And they just extend it. And then at the worst case scenario, they'll say, well, we believe Israel should do an internal investigation and see what they come up with, as if that's some sort of a reliable investigation, right? So, at the end of the day, it is just another reminder in terms of how abysmal U.S. mainstream media coverage of Israel and Gaza has been. Incredibly biased, incredibly warped, incredibly one-sided, and somehow the New York Times is choosing to just implode in on itself rather than admit their mistakes and potentially even hold their leadership accountable.